So Carl, 67 years old, and after 40 plus years of working for the U.S. government, 20 years active duty in the Army, two tours of duty in wartime, and 24 years as a civil servant, he decided it was time to retire. And he started putzing around the house, and he had lost his wife a couple years before, and was really getting very bored, not knowing what he was going to do and how he was going to fill his time. He was used to being very, very active. So he decided he was going to sell his house and move somewhere new. And that's exactly what he did. He sold his house and he moved to Los Angeles. He bought a fixer-upper. And he decided this is how he was going to spend his time. He was going to do the front garden and the back garden, and then he was going to do all the things in the house to make it exactly the kind of home he wanted to spend his retirement years. So that lasted about 2 years. He was done with all the work in the house, and he still wasn't sure what he was going to do with those retirement years. Well, every day he had started taking a walk around the neighborhood to see what was in the neighborhood, to see the sights, meet some of the people. And one day when he was walking, he found this beautiful old church. And as he looked towards the back of the church, he saw that there had been a garden there. There was a huge plot of land that was all overgrown with weeds, and the trees needed trimming, and it hadn't been taken care of, it looked like, for many, many years. But there was a beautiful bench there. And it reminded him of the time with his wife of 40 years that he had sat in benches and they had just talked and shared time together, and how they loved to look at gardens. So he would come every day on his walk and sit in that overgrown garden behind the church. And one day when he was in town, he saw a flyer on a telephone pole. Remember when they used to put flyers on telephone poles? He pulled the flyer off the telephone pole and it said, "Wanted, someone to take care of the garden behind the church." And Carl thought, this is my job. This is exactly what I'm going to do in these retirement years. So he took the flyer and went over to the pastor's office. He knocked on the door and he said, "I think this is my job." And he told the pastor about his life in the military, about his wife, and Carl hadn't had any children, so he was pretty lonely. And the pastor told him right away, "We want you to become part of our church family." And so Carl started taking care of the garden, and he started coming to church. And at that time, there were not too many people that were coming on Sundays, a couple dozen or so. But as Carl took care of the garden, and he continued to pour love into those plants and vegetable plants, and he would invite people to come and take some of the harvest. And then Saturday mornings became a time when all the congregants would come, have coffee and donuts, and then harvest the vegetables. And they'd take them home, and oftentimes they'd bring them back on Sunday for that potluck after church. And the congregation grew and grew, and to over 100 people. 20 years, Carl took care of that garden. And that Saturday morning became quite a ritual and quite an event. And the family, Carl really felt like he was part of the family, that the parents there were like his kids, and their kids were like his grandkids. So it really felt like a family to him. Well, 20 years, everything went pretty well, until one day when Carl was back in the back watering. And he heard some noise, and he turned around, and 3 thugs walked up to him. "Hey, old man, what are you doing?" They started tormenting him. And one of them pushed Carl down on the ground. Now, by this time, remember I said Carl was working there 20 years? He retired at 67, so he's late 80s by now. They pushed him down on the ground, and he couldn't get up because of the war wound in his right leg. And so the hose was flying all around, snaking all around, getting everybody all wet, and the boys were kicking him. They were throwing weeds and things on Carl and laughing. And Carl couldn't get up. Well, the pastor saw this from the window, and he came running out, and the boys saw him, so the boys took off. The pastor helped Carl up. And Carl brushed himself off and went over and picked up the hose and started weeding. And the pastor said, "Carl, what are you doing?" And Carl said, "Oh, those are just some thugs, just some boys who don't know who they are. They'll figure it out someday." And he proceeded to water. Well, the pastor figured everything was okay, so he went back into his office. A week later, those 3 boys showed up again. This time, Carl offered him a drink of water. And they didn't want the water. They took the hose, and with the hose, they squirted Carl up and down, completely soaked him. And they laughed, and then they pushed him down, stole his retirement watch and his wallet, and took off. Well, Carl just shook his head and thought, someday these boys will figure it out. Picked up the hose and started watering again. Well, a couple months later, Carl was trimming some trees, and he heard a noise. And he took a step back, and he fell over one of the big branches that he had just cut. And as he looked up, he saw the leader of that pack, the tallest boy with tattooed arms and scratched up hands. And the boy was extending his hand to Carl. Well, Carl braced himself, thinking something bad's going to happen here. And the guy said, "It's okay, old man, I'm not going to hurt you. Let me help you up." And so Carl took his hand, and he helped Carl up. And Carl said, "Why are you here?" He said, "Well, I have something for you." He said, we run around this town, my friends and I ran around this town, and we torment a lot of people who can't hurt us, people that we can take advantage of. And most people, we treat them hatefully, and they fight back, and they yell and scream. You didn't. You were really nice. You offered us water, and you didn't complain. Yet we still treated you in a really hateful way. We were hateful to you, and you were loving to us. He said, "I have something for you. I want you to know that I couldn't sleep after we stole your watch and your wallet." And out of his coat, he took a crumpled up brown paper bag, and he gave the brown paper bag to Carl. And he said, "I'll see you later, old man. I just want you to know that I'm no longer in that gang. I'm going to go to school. I'm going to change my life because you showed me something about myself that was really important, something I wanted to change." And he took off. Carl opened the bag, took out his retirement watch, and he put it on. And then he took out the wallet, and rather than looking to see if the money was there, he looked for something that was so much more important to him. A picture of his beautiful bride from 58 years before in her wedding dress. As he looked at her, he smiled, and she saw that picture smiling back at him. And then he put the wallet in his back pocket, and he proceeded to finish cutting the branches and removing all the cuttings and cleaning up the garden. Well, that Thanksgiving, they were sitting around, as most people do, and talk about the things that they're grateful for at the church. And Carl was sitting at a table with about 7 other people, and they were all talking about what they were grateful for. And Carl shared about how he was grateful to have this job, taking care of the garden to keep him busy in the retirement years for 20 years. He was grateful for that young man who had been so abusive but had turned his life around. He was going to go to college. He was no longer a thug. Carl said he told everybody this story, and he was so grateful for that young man and that experience, and to be able to be a part and to be able to witness this young man's growth. Well, that was Thanksgiving. Carl died just after Christmas that year. And the pastor decided he was going to have the memorial service in January. The church was packed, standing room only. And the pastor talked about Carl's garden and how he took care of it for 20 years, and how people would come on Saturday mornings and help harvest and take the food home and make beautiful vegetable casseroles and bring them on Sunday, how the church family grew and how important Carl was to this family. He said, Carl's garden is a metaphor for our lives. How important it is, he said, to take care of our garden, to nurture it, to feed it, to trim it, get rid of the weeds. How important it is to tend to our garden. And at that moment he looked up, and in the corner of the room he saw a young man that he had never seen before. A very tall young man with his head down looking at the ground. And he thought, I'm going to go see who that guy was. And after the service was over and everyone was having their snacks and chit-chatting, he went to look for this young man, and he couldn't find him. Well, about a week later, knock, knock, knock on the pastor's door. And in walks that young man with, guess what? A flyer that said, wanted, someone to take care of Carl's garden. And he said, I think this is my job. And then he sat down at the pastor's desk and he told them the story of Carl and how Carl had changed his life and how grateful he was for Carl. And that he was back and he was going to go to school and he wanted to start a business. He wanted to have a productive life and be a productive part of the community. And could he come to church on Sundays? And the pastor said, of course. And he gave him the keys to the garden shed. And within just a couple of months, people were helping to harvest again on Saturday mornings, and they were bringing dishes on Sunday to share. And this young man worked really hard in Carl's honor to take care of that garden for 4 years. And then at the end of the 4 years, he went into the pastor's office again, knocked on the door with the keys in his hand, and he said, you know, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but I'm not going to be able to take care of the garden any longer. And the pastor said, why? What happened? Something wrong? And the young man said, oh no, on the contrary. He said, you know, I finished school, I started a business, and the business is doing really well, but more importantly, my wife just had a baby on Saturday, and with my business, I need to spend as much time as I can with her and the baby. So I'm not going to have time to take care of the garden, but I know there'll be people here who will help with the garden. And the pastor said, oh, that's a great reason to not come and take care of the garden. Did you have a girl or boy? And the young man said, we had a boy. And he turned around to leave, and the pastor said, well, wait a minute, by the way, what did you name him? And the man looked at the pastor with a big smile and said, Carl.
Yeah.